Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the new and interesting stories in the region. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and I'll be looking at the bumpy ties between Turkey and its regional rival, the United Arab Emirates. After a sustained period of overt hostility, the sides decided to patch things up, signing a bevy of trade agreements and developing defence ties. Earlier this month, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan received UAE leader Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan in Ankara. But are relations between the two countries as positive as they're being portrayed? I put this question to Jalel Harchaoui, a fellow at the Rusi think tank in London. Jalal is one of the top analysts on Libya, where Turkey and the UAE have butted heads. Hi, Jalal. Good to have you.
Hey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So today I want to talk to you about the Turkey-UAE relationship. I know that we've discussed this quite a bit within the context of Libya, where they were initially pretty much at each other's throats, with the UAE supporting Haftar in the east and Turkey, the GNA in the west, and all of that. But then around 2021 or so, they decided to patch things up. And now we have Erdogan going to Abu Dhabi, and most recently MBZ coming to Ankara. And the narrative is that, by and large, things are hunky-dory. So Jalal, I want you to tell us whether that's actually true or not.
Well, there was a break. Something did happen in 2021. I don't think we should dismiss it entirely. I think there was this whole period, I would say, since the Arab uprisings of 2011 all the way to a decade later, where a lot of things were driven by ideology. And when Turkey intervened in a theater, it was to support political Islam. And of course, the UAE was intervening exactly for the opposite reason. So I think it's possible to argue that that period is over. And it is true also that the first couple of years after that moment that you're underscoring 2021, things were actually pretty smooth. And then there were a few theaters that started contradicting this hunky-dory fairy tale scenario. But we're still not going back to the very bitter knee-jerk reaction type conflicts that we had before 2021. So the one theater that I think everybody should bear in mind is Sudan. Sudan started with mostly the UAE supporting Houthi and the Rapid Support Forces in April 2023. And on the other side, you had, in theory, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries supporting Burhan. But the first year was difficult. And then things started looking more victorious for Burhan in 2024. And what actually made a difference was not Iran, was not Russia that has been pursuing Burhan since 2024. The one nation that really made a difference, which was exactly 180 degrees to the other side of the UAE, was Turkey. And I would like to mention one very interesting moment, which took place last May, just a couple of months ago. On May 3rd, you had a very dramatic series of airstrikes conducted using Turkish drones by the Burhan army, the Sudanese armed forces, against probably not just an RSF base, but actually a Emirati base with most likely presence on the part of UAE officers there in Niala. Nyala is a city in Darfur. And that moment was perceived by the UAE. I'm not even talking about the reaction of the RSF. From the perspective of Abu Dhabi, that attack, which was conducted using Turkish technology by the Burhan side, was experienced as a very traumatic event. And the reaction was very emotional and violent on the part of, I would say, the UAE itself. It's not so much by the RSF. We saw airstrikes against Port Sudan right after that. So that tit for tat moment was, to me, a very visual, very tangible illustration of how violent things could be with the UAE on the one side and Turkey on the other side. So this moment, I'm not describing something that took place years ago. I'm just 2 months ago. So, but of course, you have other theaters like the Tigray War, where both were on the same
Can
side.
I
And
just jump in before you go there
yeah,
about what happened? I mean, do you think Turkey knew that Burhan would be using its drones against a UAE base, what was effectively a UAE base? And of course, let's remind our audience that the UAE denies that it has any role in that conflict, right?
yeah, I think the act of asking the UAE about its covert role is kind of irrational. If it's covert and clandestine, by definition, they're going to deny it. So asking the UAE for that confirmation is an irrational gesture. You should not waste time asking them the question. It's
Mhm.
like asking Israel whether they're committing genocide. It's a waste of time. You don't.
No, but I mean, did Turkey know that that was likely to happen is the real question.
Well, the well, first of all, it's war, right? So war inside Sudan means that you are aware of which foreign actors are helping the other side, but what you're waging officially is a war against the other Sudanese party within the context of a civil war. Do they know that there was, Emirati equipment, Emirati engineering in terms of the organization of their base? They knew, of course, they knew. Now, the open question, the outstanding question, is the number of Emirati officers, because you have this rumor, and I don't have any evidence one way or another, but some version exists out there that the reason this episode was perceived as so traumatic by the UAE was because they lost a few Emirati officers in the incident, and we saw things like that happen in Libya in 2019 as well. So I think it's a possibility that we should not rule out, but. Of course, if what I'm saying is that if in a civil war with a very substantive international dimension like the Sudanese war, the mere presence of foreign actors would suffice to act like a magical air defense systems. In other words, the other side would suddenly refrain from attacking simply because maybe there's a suspicion that a couple of foreign officers are hanging out in the facility. Of course, everybody would be using that to protect themselves, and the war is war. So, but to answer your question, yes, they knew.
Okay, so moving on to Ethiopia, the other
No, I'm saying,
theater.
yeah, Ethiopia is an interesting theater because it's not current, but let's say until 2020, 2021, both countries were on the same side. And of course, the other example that I would like to mention is Libya. Libya is going through a very uncertain moment. It's really a moment of quite acute uncertainty, and the uncertainty comes from the fact that Turkey is trying to effectively embrace the eastern side, the Haftar family, which acted as its enemy during the Tripoli episode that you mentioned in your introduction. So
Right,
Turkey now can,
but wait, you're sort of galloping here.
yeah,
You mentioned Ethiopia Tigray, and you said they were on the same side. You mean the UAE and Turkey were on the same side? Could you just
yes,
very briefly unpack that for our audience?
yeah. What happened during that very lethal war? Because some estimates show that up to 300, maybe 350,000 people died during that 2 year episode. We should, like, this corresponds to a pretty good alignment between the two countries because the UAE was obviously conducting a lot of the airstrikes using its own drones to help Addis Ababa conduct its war against the Tigray province. And we should not forget that Turkey was on the same side, was not as active, not nearly as active, interfering in the conflict as the UAE, but it was definitely on the side of Addis Ababa,
Okay, so
which
that's an example of alignment, and that
right,
prompts
right.
another question because you framed the differences in Libya as being ideological. So, what brought those two sides together in a place like Ethiopia? And ultimately, don't these countries act in their perceived self-interest rather than along ideological
Exactly.
lines?
Yeah, exactly. So you're helping me convey one argument that I wanted to articulate today is I think those years, the immediate reaction to the Arab uprising, so the whole first decade after 2011, I think a lot of the drivers were ideological, particularly in the first few years, particularly in the first half decade, from 2011 to 2016, 2017, roughly. And what I was trying to say earlier is that when you saw Mohammed bin Zayed visit Ankara in 2021, it was really the end of a period where things would be decided primarily based on ideology. And we entered a period that was more pragmatic, exactly what you're saying. And and so one corollary from a mode of operation where you kind of decide theater by theater which side you're going to take, it means that there's no real alignment. So sometimes you'll agree and sometimes you disagree. And what matters is the reaction of a country like the UAE, which is still far away from the, let's say, if you look at the arms industry of Turkey, is still far more advanced than the UAE in terms of commitment, quality of execution, still much more advanced than the UAE. So what's interesting here is when you see them disagree on a case like Sudan, how does the UAE respond? Does it up the ante, or does it remember that Turkey is still more excellent than it is when it comes to just implementing its foreign policy? And I think the UAE has learned to be careful, not to just keep escalating. And we can see also the same thing about Turkey. Turkey is not resisting what is happening currently in Sudan. You have a secession of Darfur that is being worked on, and this is a really a painful, violent project which requires a lot of weapons being injected by the UAE, and Turkey is not really fighting it. Is not encouraging Burhan to stop this from happening. So I think what I was trying to say earlier, the fact that we entered a new period where you still have theaters and areas and territories and geographies where both countries disagree, there's still more pragmatism than before 2021.
So, how does that play out in Libya, where, as you have described to our monitor quite recently, Turkey is courting the Haftar family, the big allies of the UAE? Does
Yeah,
this again show that Turkey and the UAE are being pragmatic and
yeah,
working
yeah.
together in Libya? Or what?
Well, the UAE is definitely being pragmatic on Libya right now. I think one possible analysis is that the UAE is aware, it's very cognizant of the fact that Turkey is taking a lot of risks. It believes that it could actually pull this form of acrobatics by considering Tripoli secure, and then going out on this adventure that consists in pursuing a charm offensive towards Haftar and trying to kind of uh, come out on top and end up being the only foreign state that really would have great influence in Tripoli and great influence in Benghazi at the same time. This is what Turkey is trying to pull off. Personally, I'm very skeptical. But what's very interesting here is that the UAE is kind of watching all of this and says, I don't mind. This is pretty good for me. So the UAE is actually quite happy with this because in the East, as you just said, the big ally and the historical ally, I would say even the organic ally, this inseparable from the UAE is Haftar. Haftar cannot say no to the UAE. Haftar is married to Abu Dhabi forever as a family, as a dictatorship, familial dictatorship that controls the east and south of Libya and might even try to get Tripoli tomorrow. So the UAE says, okay, well, Turkey is trying to flirt with my actor, my proxy. I like it. I like it because I will always be closer to the Haftar family than Turkey. Turkey could send weapons, could send all kinds of gimmicks and goodies and gifts. But ultimately, if there's a problem tomorrow, the Haftar family will still be mine.
But wait,
And
Jalal, wait. I mean, in the meantime, of course, there's another family, the Debevas, who are
yeah,
running the West and the
mhm,
international recognized government in Tripoli, who must be
yeah,
pretty pissed off by all of this.
yeah,
And
yeah,
especially as you keep pointing out, this talk of a unity government, which would effectively mean that they lose their monopoly, right?
correct. Yeah,
And
yeah.
Turkey
And
is touting this line, but yet you
yes,
say this is all very risky and could end in tears. Can you
yeah,
unpack that? And the second thing I want you to address is, of course, the whole business of this maritime agreement, which is another reason Turkey is courting Haftar, because they want them to recognize it as well, the maritime agreement that
yeah,
got
yeah.
Greece and
The
Cyprus, in a tizzy.
absolutely, absolutely. I would say that it's probably the only serious substantial driver that explains Turkey's behavior. Turkey, of course, would win more construction contracts in the east, would win more oil and gas contracts in the east in terms of what happens onshore. But its true aim, the one that's really causing Turkey to take a lot of risks, is really the ratification by the eastern-based parliament of Libya of the 2019 Maritime Border Memorandum of Understanding. That's the true goal. That's the true aim of Turkey.
And so will
And
UAE sign off? Because as you say, Haftar is joined at the hip with UAE and won't act without their consent, I assume, or maybe not. I don't.
yes,
So will
yeah,
you
yes.
go for that?
The reason, so the rationale of the UAE, why does it accept this? First of all, because so far, even though from a nationalistic perspective, the maritime aspect of things has been a key catalyst of nationalism under Erdogan over the last several years, in terms of hydrocarbons, we should remember that no seismic survey has discovered anything so far in the Mediterranean. So it looks like the UAE doesn't mind this aspect of things. It's not really in the Mediterranean anyway, so it doesn't care. It pretended that it cared in 2020 because it felt humiliated in Libya, so it kind of started getting involved with Greece and Cyprus and started to pretend that it cared about all these things. But the maritime issue is no big deal for the UAE. But what it sees, and you said it just a few seconds ago. You said that the Beiba family, the family that is in power in Tripoli, so far recognized by the UN, but it could end soon. This form of recognition. The Beiba family has actually received support from the UAE from 2021 until a few weeks ago. And a few weeks ago, because of the violence in Tripoli, because of this change in attitude on the part of Turkey, there was a collapse. The collapse not all, between the Dbeiba family and the UAE. In other
Why?
words, the UAE.
Why? Why?
The reason is because the Dbeiba family realized that the reason the UAE had been supporting it in Tripoli is because it was militarily weak. The Emiratis loved the weakness of the Dbeiba family from a military perspective. And when the Dbeiba family started showing some military muscles and territorial expansion ambitions, then the UAE changed its attitude.
Okay, so we
So,
need to also remind the audience what that is because it refers to the sort of factions in the sort of west,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Southwest, which
So, yeah,
have
so
nothing to do with Haftar. And I mean, it's
exactly. So
kind of
what
complicated. Yeah.
what the audience should kind of visualize is that the east and the south of Libya are more or less entirely under the control of the Haftar family, but Western counterpart of the Haftar family, in other words, the Dbeibeh family, the family of the UN recognized prime minister in Tripoli, doesn't even control all of Tripoli itself, not even downtown Tripoli, the Libyan capital. So it's very much more fractured. And what we saw in mid-May was for the first time almost the prime minister basically take on a military role and started using sheer violence to try and impose himself as the true leader of Tripoli, finally. So, in other words, for 4 years, he was effectively a weak prime minister on a military level, and he was just busy striking financial deals and corrupt arrangements with various actors, including the Haftar family in the east and other rival militias in Tripoli. And because he saw that Turkey was kind of abandoning him, he decided to survive by using violence and try to emerge as a hegemon of Tripoli.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
So what I'm saying is that the Dbeibeh family doesn't look like it on the surface, lost of its two main foreign sponsors, both Turkey and the UAE, in a matter of weeks earlier this year.
And so
And
that's
it's
why you keep waving a red flag saying there's danger lying ahead
yeah,
because
yeah.
the whole equilibrium could collapse and the Debebas could play the spoiler and reignite the conflict. Is that what you're saying, Jalal?
Yeah, in other words, Turkey might find out the hard way that despite its military entrenchment in the Tripoli area, might still not be able to prevent war. So this idea that simply because it's around, because it has a few drones and a few spies and a few mercenaries from Syria, that it can actually prevent Libyans from fighting each other in an urban area like Tripoli. Maybe Turkey is right to assume that. I don't think it's right to assume that. I think you will find out that you cannot prevent Libyans from fighting
Okay,
in
so
their
then
own country.
will the UAE be sort of chomping on its popcorn as that happens? Will
Exactly.
there be a
Yeah.
certain degree of Schadenfreude?
Yeah, the UAE loves all of this because it says, okay, I'll keep Haftar in all cases. Turkey is helping Haftar become stronger, but Haftar organically will always be mine. And if the Tripoli situation turns into a nightmare, we'll lay it upon the door of Turkey. And if it's a success, then by definition, the new government will only be more friendly to my proxy, the Haftar family, anyway. So either I win or I win. So that's why the UAE is so silent on Libya. And the other thing is what's interesting is the connection between Libya and Sudan. Because if you take this rationale of Turkey trying to please Haftar, Haftar is still very busy supporting the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, in their project of seceding Darfur from the rest of Sudan, and you have tons of weapons going into Libya from the UAE for that purpose, and Turkey is not preventing this, even though it's supporting the Sudanese armed forces. In other words, one way of saying it is Turkey cares so much about pulling off this reversal that I was talking to you about a few minutes ago in Libya that it's even ready to accept the secession of Darfur. And the secession of Darfur would be a great way for the UAE to save face, because let's remember that the UAE has shown a terrible level of performance in Sudan since 2023. It's been dismal.
So let's talk about Syria, because you mentioned the
Yeah.
Syrian mercenaries, and Syria is
Mhm.
another theater
Yeah.
where, you know, mouthpieces for the UAE would claim, oh, Turkey and the UAE are in agreement. I heard someone say 90% of the time. I mean, Is that true?
I think it is true in the sense that what I see is the UAE having completely accepted that its multi-year investment in Bashar al-Assad went up the smoke in December 2024. There's a new reality. So, of course, that reality gets articulated in two phases. First of all, you have the euphoria. You know, the new government in Damascus is gonna kick out Russia, and it's gonna basically make the UAE persona non grata. Nobody needs their money anyway, and this is a Turkish victory. And over time, as months go by, what we see is effectively the new Damascus becoming more pragmatic, more humble vis-a-vis Russia. You saw the increased level of interaction between Russia and Damascus over the last several weeks.
Well,
Russia,
Shaibani is in the in Moscow
yeah,
as we speak.
yeah, and what we're seeing is that the argument of the UAE, probably the argument that the UAE always puts forward, which is the ability to inject capital money, is probably going to work with the new government in Damascus. So the UAE has accepted that all those years where it kind of like really became associated so closely with Bashar al-Assad in Syria was basically a waste. Um, and kind of works with the new reality on the ground. So there's an acceptance of
But they
Turkey
do
in the
have
same
a
way,
finger in
as Turkey.
the, sorry to interrupt, but they do have a finger in the Kurdish pie, which annoys, irritates Turkey.
Yeah, by definition, they because I mean the Kurdish part of Syria is a portion that is, as you said, very problematic for Ankara. But we also know that the new Syrian government doesn't want to be too dogmatic vis-a-vis the Kurds. So there's no real inconsistency between pursuing Damascus and keeping all the existing connections to to the Kurdish area. So yeah, this is just like a little leverage that the Emiratis have, and they will probably use it. But I don't think it'll be too aggressive.
And what about those Syrian mercenaries? I mean, on both sides of the conflict in Libya, what will happen to them?
Well, in the East, I haven't seen any evidence of them still being there. I think they're gone. In the Tripoli area, just before the collapse of Bashar in Damascus, what we had was basically a number of, I would say, probably like 3,000 overall, but 3,000 that you could not necessarily mobilize. You probably have like 2,000 that you could mobilize and 1,000 that just kind of got lost in the woodwork. Opened the shop, bought a villa, got old, just, maybe moved their money and kind of invested in real estate. So it's not because you had 3,000 physical Syrians in the greater Tripoli area, including parts of Misrata and things like that, that you could just suddenly mobilize all of them in case of a conflict. And then to add insult to injury, after the fall of Assad in early December 2024, a bunch of them left, returned to their home country. So now you're left with probably, I would say, that you could mobilize something like 1,500 or slightly less. And I mean, they're there. I mean, it's not really something that Libyans like to talk about. They don't see it uh, as a major asset in case of a conflict.
Well, if they open a few restaurants, they could become a major asset. Everywhere the
Yeah,
Syrians go and open restaurants, they've really
exactly.
the
Yeah.
the cuisine, haven't they? But just one last thing. I guess after this conversation, I'm wondering whether the framing of it was kind of wrong-headed, because what we seem to have concluded is that the UAE and Turkey sort of had a go at each other and both kind of recognized that this wasn't great for either of them and have decided to slap a band-aid on everything. And so I guess they're kind of frenemies, right?
Yeah, they talk more than before 2021. But the reason I insisted on the Nyala/Port Sudan episode is that they could still kill each other.
So there is the
There's
potential for this relationship to deteriorate again.
Yeah, but never to the lows that we saw. I just doubt it. I don't think we'll return to the atmosphere we had like typically in 2014, where everything was completely driven by this ideological obsession. Now things are more about business, territory, commercial opportunities, governance models, but not so much ideology. And so you could have incidents, you could have even conflicts where they're completely on opposite sides, like we saw over the last 18 months in Sudan, but there's still a communication channel. They're still talking, and they're not completely demonizing each other the way they did before 2021. So they moved to something a little bit closer to what we have seen between Russia and Turkey. Russia and Turkey could still do ugly things to each other, but they still talk. They're still on WhatsApp every evening.
Yeah, I think they're very similar in that respect. And also Turkey, Iran, they sort of compartmentalize the relationship. So you see them cooperating in some areas and challenging each other, butting heads in others. Jalal, one final question. Who's come on top of this sort of power struggle between these two countries ultimately? Can we declare a winner or is it a kind of a draw?
I think in terms of execution, Turkey is far superior. It has an ability to forge a foreign policy and maintain it for several years, like really over 5, 10, 15 years. It remembers that you could sometimes die when you wage war, and you don't necessarily have to start crying or withdraw from the battlefield simply because a couple of your officers died. So there's a quality and a rigor to the execution of Turkey, plus a very strong arms industry that makes it more serious than the UAE. The UAE has shown, particularly through the Sudanese tragedy of the last 2 years or more, that it doesn't know how to execute, it doesn't know how to implement. It just runs around with its checkbook and doesn't control the human aspect of war, thinks that it's just the material expenditures everywhere and doesn't know how to execute. So to me, I will. So Turkey is still terrible on the economy, absolutely disastrous. But in terms of foreign policy, I think it's a much more serious actor than the UAE, and even more serious than a lot of members of NATO or the EU.
Okay, well, if we have anyone from the Turkish government tuning in, they'll be pretty thrilled by your
Yeah, but I mean that,
contribution.
but I still maintain what I said about Tripoli. I think Turkey is going to deliver a disaster in Tripoli within the next few weeks, which will negate a lot of what I said.
Well, we're going to have to talk to you again then very soon. Let's hope nothing horrible happens, but lots of horrible stuff going on around us. Jalal, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you again.
And that's all for this week's episode of On the Middle East. For more in-depth, independent and interesting reporting on the Middle East, go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.